absolute pleasure, honor, and privilege to have all of you with us today at the 10th Sunil Memorial Lecture. And nothing can be more than to have Professor Devy with us today. So I have been given the task to introduce him, not that he really needs introduction, but I think for the younger generation who are still reading some of his works or who have just joined JNU, maybe it will be good to know about Professor Devy. I think it is humbling and also extremely honorable because he was, as Anthony was saying, having a book tour of the book that he published all over the world, and without a hesitation for a second, when I wrote to him, he accepted the invitation. So many thanks, Professor Devy, on behalf of all of us in JNU, particularly from the Sunil Memorial trustees, mentors, patrons, and dear students and colleagues. Professor Devy actually is multiverse a person. He's not only a writer, but I think he's a cultural literary critic, he's an institution builder, he's a multilingual writer, he writes in Gujarati, Marathi, English, and more than that, I think his work on languages, cultures, education, and many other spheres actually takes us to a kind of thinking we generally don't do in social sciences very often. For the sake of introduction, let me say a few things about Professor Devy before I say a little bit about his works and how I think his understanding about the category of language actually is very different from many other writers that you read. Professor Devy has more than 90 books to his credit, self-authored, edited, and numerous articles. Some of you might have been reading him in newspapers and many other magazines that he often writes. He's a public intellectual and very, very conscious, if I can use the word, a conscience keeper of our society. And if you just scroll down, you will see in the public domain how often he actually takes the issues which need to be taken right away. The latest volume, which is magnum opus in my view, is titled The Indians' Histories of a Civilization, where he traces the history of 12,000 years, but there are more than 100 contributors to this very ambitious project that he took. But his first work, if I'm not wrong, After Amnesia, a celebrated work, actually opened an intellectual sort of floodgate of thinking about the idea of literary criticism and how thinking about literary criticism through Indian languages needs to be thought through much more carefully rather than taking Western European tradition of looking at literary criticism. I think if one has read After Amnesia, one is not really surprised to see where Professor Devy has taken us in his intellectual journey. He has actually in some way inaugurated a new era in the literary historiography after the Amnesia book and many other works that he has produced since then. His work on many heroes actually on Indian literary criticism and Indian literature is another very, very interesting work to read. After having studied at Shivaji University at Kolhapur, where he did his PhD on the poetry of Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, and later on got Rotary Foundation Fellowship, which allowed him, and this is something which I found out recently, to choose a university of his own choice anywhere in the world to do further studies, and he chose University of Leeds for his second master's thesis, where he wrote his thesis on none other than A.K. Ramanujan, another very, very prominent literary writer of our country. He taught at the Department of English at MSU Baroda for only 15 years, and he was telling us at tea that he left at the age of 45 because he had better things to do than just stay within the confines of the university. And he then won during this period, he also won many fellowships to go to Yale University, and was a Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow. For his work on languages and particularly to tribal languages, tribal communities, he won prestigious awards. Awards like Sahitya Academy in 1993, Padma Shri Award in 2014, SARC Writers Award in 2001, Prince Claus Award, and Lingua Pax Award, which is one of the highest awards for work in languages and literatures, in 2011 for the kind of work he has done in the domain of linguistic diversity and preservation. More than winning the awards and lecturing all over the world, I think what is remarkable and truly astounding about Professor Devy is that he has been an institution builder. He has set up institutions on his own without much of his state funding, I would say. Institutions such as Bhasha Research Center at Baroda in 1996 to study the denotified and nomadic tribes and groups and their languages. Later on with Mahashweta Devi and Lakshman Gaikwad, he founded the DNT, that is Denotified and Nomadic Tribes Action Group in June 1998. The following year, in 1999, he founded the much talked about and much known now, the Adivasi Academy at Tejgarh, and this was one of the reasons he quit his job at MSU Baroda to study further the tribal communities or the children of these tribal communities to learn in their own languages. I think that another work that Professor Devy did, which I don't think anybody else can dare to do, is the People's Sign Linguistic Survey of India, which he started in 2011. People's Linguistic Survey of India was done exactly after 100 years, after Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, the colonial attempt to count and classify the languages. And Professor Devy is also a very persuasive person, and not just simply armchair intellectual, because he knows about each and every corner of this country. So there were 3,000 volunteers who joined him in doing this new linguistic survey of India, independent India, without any state funding. And I remember, because he also wrote me in this project, he dedicated the 50 volumes which came out of this PSLI to the nation on the day when the work was completed at Gandhi Peace Foundation, with a very emotive atmosphere that he created there. And the PSLI tells us, apart from the census enumeration of languages, which is different over the years, that there are 780 Indian languages still working, but there could have been 100 more languages, but unfortunately 220 languages seem to have died. These volumes have been published they are multilingual volumes, they are not just published in English by Orient Blacksman. He also remarkably gave in many of his, I think, activities, both as intellectual, as a conscientious person. He returned his Sahitya Academy Award as a mark of protest against the assault on intellectual freedom and murder of intellectuals like Kalburgi, Pansare, Daupgar, and Gauri Lankesh. I think that takes a courage to return the award which he truly deserved. Not only this, he returned to Dharwad in 2016, meaning to say he left his home in Baroda and decided to settle in Dharwad at that age. And he started a Dakshayan movement, which I think is one of its kind. The Dakshayan movement described very loosely as a southward movement of artists and intellectuals, which now has spread to many other states like West Bengal, Telangana, Gujarat, UP, Goa, and Delhi. It aims to collect the linguistic discourses and purities of various kinds and defies the dictum which seems to be the norm these days in political speeches, one language and one nation. In 2015, he was also actively involved with the Global Language Status Report. He has also, as I said, he is not simply an armchair intellectual and academic, which he actually, in some ways, he actually brings in his scholarly activism to the front, and therefore has put the script of 11 languages, which is no small job, which were predominantly oral earlier. He has put more than 20,000 tribal children in the non-formal school educational system and has promoted and published literature in 26 languages, campaigned for the protection of the rights of the tribal communities in many, many places of the country. So, how does one talk about his writings, which are enormous? As I said, more than 190 volumes. Of course, it's not fair on my part even to summarize the main argument, but what I did, since I've been a great follower of his writings, I thought I would share some of my ideas that I understood and I took from his writings, which actually in some way synchronize with Sunil's ideological commitment of Jal Jangal Jameen. We can add Jal Jangal Jameen Juwan, all four. So one of the things I think Professor Devy has been arguing for a very long time, that Homo sapiens are lingual. That means they need language or they are born with language. And that defines the distinction between human beings and animal world. And he carries this forward to many of his writings in many different ways. He's also very emphatic about the fact that knowledge gets transferred through languages, because languages bring the sensory perception of the phenomenal world surrounding us. And this can be done generationally, and that can also affect the memory formation of individuals and societies. Similarly, in his writings, he continues to emphasize that experiences are made sense of through gestures, senses, languages, and memories. They are codified, they create the possibilities of remembering through classificatory logic, different taxonomies of grammar and logic. I would also like to add here that Professor Devy is not a traditional linguist, one who only looks at grammar as if it is frozen in time and space. Actually, his understanding about language is something like a living life of people that he has been interacting and living with. So he does talk about language in a very, very different way than from many others that you will know. Language, therefore, distinguishes humans in his understanding from animal species. It provides a bridge between past and future, and he has said it in many places that the present is important to understand the past. He considers language to be extremely important in the evolutionary schema of human beings over centuries, or to understand the idea of or the discovery of being. He is also someone who is extremely concerned about the way in which narratives are produced or promoted, or the idea of history is promoted and produced. And I think there can't be a better time than this to hear the critique from him about the way in which historical narratives are produced for certain specific political purposes. Through language, he continues to say, we express creativity and champion the cause of the preservation of cultures. And I was really stuck in one of the writings. He says that during tsunami, the Andamanese, the original inhabitants of Andamanese, the Andamanese community, did not suffer much of a devastation because they had the ecosystem that they made sense of through their own linguistic and cultural science systems. So language is not simply an instrument of communication, simply a strategy of communication, but it is also part of the cultural ecosystem, the cultural habitus, the cultural world that we all breathe and live in. Language is speech is something I think Professor Devy continues to emphasize, and therefore he departs from these very traditional Chomskyan understanding of language as just reduced to grammar or even in grammar. It is in utterances, in its daily evocation, it's in gestures, in its symbols, in its signs that each one of us is constituting the language. And he has extensively worked on this framework, which actually is something that we in JNU would be very familiar with, because over here we read Bakhtin and Voroshilov and Marx and so forth, all of whom talk about language as a dialogical imagination. So language is speech, writing comes much later to record memory and for transactional purposes, which he emphasizes is carried on by Homo sapiens. Language is also a source of security for defense, for migration, for communication. In other words, language is symbolic, it is emotive, it is cultural, but at the same time, the same language is also used to create and perpetrate forms of violence. Another aspect of language which I think is central to his understanding and which will strike a chord with us is the idea of intersubjectivity, which I think not many linguists talk about because they look at language as a structure more than as a practice. The idea of human communication creating habitus, structures of feeling, the same way as Raymond Williams talks about it, or creating the idea of conducting ourselves. I mean, he has a beautiful take on how the genes give us a habit of conducting ourselves and not simply genes in the manner in which we understand. So, without further to say more, though I could go on, I would only like to say that Professor Devy is someone who symbolizes that life must be lived without fear. Without fear and under no conditions of or constraints of any kind, living under freedom is a cherished dream for all civilizations, and that's where Professor Devy's work on languages, cultures, and civilizations is absolutely remarkable for our times. Therefore, we must move away from this whole idea of one nation, one language, one culture, one tax, one citizenship, one election, and so forth. Professor Devy's work actually strongly reminds us that the idea of civilization is in plurality and diversity and not in oneness. So true in legacy and memory of Sunil, there could not be a better person than Professor Devy today to mark the 10th memorial lecture. And I would only end by saying that it is in his labyrinth of imagination, an academic imagination, and activism, which is a true solace in these terrible times when Gaza is burning, humanity is being murdered, and both Palestine and Ukraine need answers from us. So we are extremely grateful and privileged to have Professor Devy with us on this Jal, Jameen, Jungle and Zuban.